Once upon a time, there was a school, a boarding school, a British boarding school. And this school had children of all ages. And as these kids grew into their teen years, they did the things that kids always do. They formed friendships, they formed cliques, they formed crushes on each other. But then one day, the kids learned the horrifying reason of why they were actually at the school. They were destined for a terrifying, painful future. And now they had to choose if they were going to fulfill that destiny or choose a different path. That's the premise of Kazuo Ishiguro's 2005 classic, Never Let Me Go. And it sounds like a good setup for a YA novel, right? Well, this isn't a YA novel. This isn't a story where our intrepid, relatable, socially outcast protagonist overcomes their traumas and their fears to start the revolution with their friends. No. Ishiguro paints a portrait that is much more intimate, much more harrowing, much more accurate to real life than I expected it to be. So join me on this spoiler-heavy, semi-deep dive into the world of Never Let Me Go on this episode of Shoulda Books. So this book is the April selection for the Shoulda Book Club. The Shoulda Book Club, if you are not familiar, happens over on Fable. If you would like to sign up, you can do so at the link in the description. We choose a different classic book every month. We read along, and at the end of the month, I put out an episode like this. And if you are loving Shoulda Books and you want to support the show, the best way you can do that is by signing up for the Shoulda Books Patreon. Patreon.com/ShouldaBooks. Over there, you will find ad-free extended episodes of episodes like this, and you will find bonus episodes, bonus videos, bonus content, Discord access. So head on over to patreon.com/ShouldaBooks. Now, one of the benefits that is included with a Patreon membership is the ability to leave a voicemail about the book of the month. And today, we are going to be hearing from a patron who also happens to be my sister, Emily. She is a patron. She also is a big fan of Never Let Me Go. This is a book that she really loves. It's one of her favorite movies, which we'll talk about the adaptation, the 2010 adaptation starring Carey Mulligan, Andrew Garfield, Keira Knightley, and a bunch of other actors that I really like. We will get to that. So stay tuned. Now, let's get into this book, shall we? So this book was published in 2005, and it marked a bit of a departure for the author. He'd kind of made his name writing more grounded, realistic novels like The Remains of the Day, which I haven't read, but I've heard is great and also has a great film adaptation. This was Kazuo Ishiguro's first foray into science fiction. Kind of doesn't feel like that sometimes, but there is the kind of backbone, kind of the whole point of this book is a science fiction premise, which I can't really talk about without spoiling anything. So if you haven't read the book and you don't want to hear any spoilers, this is your last warning, okay? We're all good? All right. Moving forward. So this novel is narrated by Kathy H. She is 31 years old, and she has this job as a carer. Now, she doesn't really explain what that is, but from what we can tell, she's kind of driving around to different medical facilities, and she's helping these people who are called donors. They're doing donations of some kind, and it's clearly taking a toll on their health. Now, a lot of these donors are people that she knew from school, and were even some of her close friends. They all went to this school called Hailsham. Now, I should point out that it's not explicitly stated in the text, and frankly, I didn't necessarily realize this until I watched the movie. The events of this book are set in like a fictionalized alternate timeline England that starts in the 1970s and continues into the 1990s. So when we're meeting Kathy, it's the 90s. She's in her 30s. She starts reminiscing and telling about her time at this school at Hailsham that is in this fictionalized version of the 1970s. So she starts telling the story of her time at Hailsham and specifically her friendship with Ruth and Tommy. Ruth is kind of like she's a bit like the popular girl, and she's very bossy, but she's also a good friend at times. She's kind of a frustrating character. She's frustrating in that like she is very real. Like I think we've all known a Ruth at some point in our lives, and maybe we've been a Ruth at some point in our lives. And over across the board, like all these characters are just very well observed and well realized and feel like real people, which is an important point that we will come back to. I don't know why I'm teasing this. If you've come this far, you know what the book is about, but I have an outline and I'm sticking with it. So moving forward, we have Ruth, who is bossy. We have Tommy, who is good-hearted, but not really, the sharpest crayon in the box. He also has a temper. He tends to fly off the handle, but he is very sweet, and he's very loving, and he's very giving. You can't help but love Tommy. He's just such a lovable goof. So Kathy is telling the story, and as she's telling the story, she tends to focus on what kind of feel like inconsequential interpersonal dynamics. Kind of across the board, that is what Kathy's narration is focused on, is on the kind of minute dramas that happen moment to moment between her and her friends. But in the background, she drops some clues here and there about what's going on at this school. For instance, the kids never leave. They never leave. There's never any talk of parents. It doesn't seem like they have parents. The teachers are called guardians, and they have a very kind of standoffish relationship with the kids. And they push the kids to be really good at art in a way that, it feels like you normally see that with STEM, of just like, oh, you need to be really good at math so that you can get a really good job. At this school, they're pushing them to, you need to be really good at drawing. You need to be really good at painting. And it's not really clear why. Other than there's this kind of mysterious benefactor who they call Madame, who shows up from time to time and takes some of the best artwork from the students and whisks it away to, the students don't know where. They assume that there's this gallery. And it's a big deal to get one of your artworks featured in Madame's gallery. So these are all kind of the details that are getting peppered in the background. But the bulk of of Kathy's narration is focusing on her relationships. But then one day, one of the guardians, Miss Lucy, kind of snaps, and she talks to the students, and she tells them point blank what is going on. The students of Hailsham are clones. Once they reach adulthood, their vital organs will be harvested and transplanted into quote-unquote normal people, and the students will die. And that is the path that is laid out before them, the purpose that they have been allotted in this life. If they choose to, they can serve as carers, which is what Kathy is doing right now, which is caring for other donors as they're in the process. But sooner or later, before you reach middle age, if you're one of these students, you are going to have to become a donor, and you are going to die. It's pretty heavy stuff. I'll be honest, I did not really see it coming, but in hindsight, it's like, oh yeah, duh. Obviously, that's what it is. I mean, we're talking about donations at the very beginning. Like, how did I not see this? But I think Ishiguro does a great job of kind of putting the reader in the same headspace as the Hailsham kids, where you learn just enough to kind of keep going along with the plot, but you're not really learning what is actually going on until this scene when Miss Lucy reveals it. And when she does, you're like, yeah, okay, yeah, obviously that's what it is. And I think that is a great metaphor for what it's like to grow up. Adults have a responsibility to shield kids from the all the horrors of life, but at some point they have to let them know, hey, this world's kind of fucked, So that gets into some territory that I want to circle back to in a little bit, but for right now, I was aghast. I was taken aback by the revelation that they were clones, even though, yeah, it seems so painfully obvious, and I was a little embarrassed that I did not get it at first. it kind of reminded me of a George Saunders short story called John, which is about these kids at like a facility / school who are there to be to test products. Like I thought it was going to be something like that. Like I thought, oh, these kids are going to be they're going to be doing experiments on these kids at some point. Maybe they already are. Like I thought it was going to be something like that. But the clone angle specifically, I didn't catch. So once it's out in the open, what is going on here? That is when my chief frustration with this book started. I found this book very frustrating. Part of that, I should point out that I read this book on my phone, which I do not recommend, but it was kind of a drastic circumstances sort of thing. I was traveling. I didn't have time / ability to get a copy of the book, and I was like, I need to start reading it. And I don't really want to do the audiobook on this one. I'm more of a visual learner, so for book club books, I like to be able to read them. That just my brain works better that way. So I was like, you know what I can do is I can get an e-reader on my phone and I can download the book. Shout out to my friend Julian who told me about this hack, if you can call it that, a while ago. He was like, look, man, if you're going to be on your phone, you might as well be reading. And I was like, I see your logic, but I'm not doing that until this situation came about. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to give it a try. And you know what? I got through it. It was not the ideal way to read a book, but I did enjoy some of those stolen minutes when you're like standing in line for something, or you're waiting for something. When I would normally be checking Instagram, I pulled out this book and I read it that way. So it was not the ideal way to read this book, but that is not the main reason that I was frustrated by this book. No, the main reason I was frustrated by this book was because once it's revealed that the students are clones and they have this horrible fate ahead of them, they kind of go about life just like they were before. Like Kathy's narration continues to focus on her friendships and the dramas that are unfolding, while this horrific fate is just barreling towards them. She is jealous when Ruth and Tommy become a couple. She gets in fights with Ruth. She feels like an outcast from some of the other folks. They reach the end of their time at Hailsham, and then they start this kind of gap year situation at the cottages out in kind of the, I want to say the Cotswolds. I don't know if it was the Cotswolds, but that's the only kind of rural region of England that I know, other than Yorkshire. I know about the moors, because of Wuthering Heights. Real heads know. But they kind of have this like gap year sort of thing where they are out in the country and they're really kind of unsupervised. Like for all intents and purposes, they have their freedom. Like they're in the middle of nowhere, but they can get access to cars. They're not like locked up in any sort of way. And so they could try to escape, but they don't. They don't like fight back. They don't try to, change the system or bring it down in any way. They just kind of shuffle along towards the thing that they know is coming. And they don't take really any like serious action to avoid that. They do take some action though. I do have to give them that. So there's a rumor that goes around that if two clones are in love with each other, that they can get a deferral and they can put off starting their donations for a couple of years and they can live together. So ultimately, Kathy and Tommy get together and they give it a try. They try to apply for this deferral, which again is not an escape. It's just a deferral. It's just pushing off for a couple of years, the inevitable. But they find out that the rumor was never true, that it was never possible to get this deferral. And again, they accept their fate. And the book ends with Tommy dying, completing after his fourth donation, and with Kathy learning that she's going to be doing her first donation very soon. So, God, it is a bleak ending. And like I said, it was frustrating because the whole time I'm like, why are you not trying to escape? Why are you not trying to band together and like bring down this awful, inhumane system? And then I realized, shit, that's what we do, isn't it? You know? And I think that is the brilliance of this book, is that it's a mirror, you know? It's true in several different ways. So, in the first way, it's a kind of a story about mortality. We know that we're going to die. I know that I'm going to die someday. You know that you're going to die someday. And yet, we don't really believe it, do we? At least when we're young. The older I get, the more I'm like, okay, yeah, this is going to happen. But when you're young, you're like, yeah, okay, I know that, but it doesn't feel real, you know? And you don't think about it too much. You don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about it. And you go about your business. You have your crushes and you have your friendships and you have your interpersonal drama. And every day you get closer to the fate that awaits us all. And so I think that this book it's such a simple thing, but by just showing that in kind of this extreme circumstance, it's asking us to grapple with that for ourselves. Like, how do you deal with that information? So then I think that the book shows some of the ways that we try to deal with that. And one of those ways is through art. So, like I said before, there's a big, emphasis at Hailsham on creating art, and Tommy gets the theory that like, oh, they're using that to like prove that we have souls and are in love, and that's the importance of it. So when we apply for this deferral, they'll be able to look at our art and tell, okay, yeah, these people really truly are in love. And he thinks that his art is going to save him, but it doesn't. And this is something that I've talked about on the show before, is this idea of, can art save you? Obviously that requires defining what we mean by save. I think in this instance, it's like, can art assuage the pain of knowing you're going to die? I think for me, this is something that I have grappled with a lot in my life, because when I was younger, I absolutely saw my art, and by art, I mean the bad screenplays I was working on in my early to mid-20s. I saw that as the thing that was going to let me cheat death, because I was going to create these movies that were going to stand the test of time and that were going to outlive me and make sure that my name is not forgotten. But the thing that I always ended up running into, and that would then send me spinning out, was that, well, nothing lasts forever. Let's say you make an incredible film. Let's pick an incredible film. Let's say, I don't know, Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas. That's a pretty great film. Everyone loves that film. And, it's going to be remembered after he dies. It'll still be remembered in 20 years. It'll still probably be remembered in 40 years. Is it going to be remembered in 100 years? I don't know. Maybe. 200 years? Less likely. 1,000 years? Probably not. So like, even if you create something that lasts longer than yourself, and look, this is still part of the motivation of why I do what I do. Like, I'm not going to lie and say that I have completely divorced myself from this type of thinking. Like, obviously, like, I want to leave behind a body of work that means something to people, and that keeps my memory alive at some point, whenever that inevitably happens. But it's just kicking the can. Like, at some point, this video file will be erased from the last server. At some point, the last copy of Never Let Me Go will disintegrate into dust, and it'll be gone. That could be, 10 years from now. That could be 1,000 years from now. But the result is still the same. It's going to end. So if it's not art, another way that we can kind of deal with our mortality is through family. And that's kind of talked about obliquely in this book by the fact that like the clones can't have children. That's one of the things they can't do. Like physically they can't. And so, they kind of have this found family, but in our world, that I think is often a motivation for people to have children. Certainly not the only motivation. And look, if you want to have kids, go for it. I think that's a great thing to do with your life. But if the motivation is like, I want to have kids so that my name can live on, it's like, what's the first name of your great grandmother? Do you know it? I know two of my great grandmother's first names, Anne and Pearl, but I don't know the other two. And the generation before them, I don't know any of their first names, and that wasn't that long ago. I think part of that is being an American. I think that, we are particularly bad at remembering the past, but I think that holds true for everyone. It's like at some point in your family tree, if you go back far enough, you're not going to know who those people are. So this motivation of wanting to kind of cheat death through that means is also ultimately a fool's errand. So we're left with the question of like, what do you do with this information? Obviously, all this is a huge bummer. And this book is kind of a huge bummer in a lot of ways, but it makes us wrestle with these questions, which I think is very important. I think that these are some of the deepest, most ancient questions that humans have always asked, because I think the other main question that this book is asking is, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to have a soul? What is that? And to answer that, I want to come back to the banality of Kathy's narration. She is spending her time narrating these quotidian dramas, and that is the most human thing you can do, because that is what we do. That is how we spend our time. Like this book, in the world of this book, there is such a question of like, are these clones human or not? Are these clones human or not? And this book spends the whole time just showing us people who are so relatable and so identifiable that there's no question. There's no question of like whether these people are human or not. But it is one of those questions that is so hard to define. It's like trying to press down on a watermelon seed. The harder you press, the more it's going to slip out from under you. But I think that is what being human is. It's having that paradox. It's having the paradox of knowing you're going to die, but living as if you're not going to. It's thinking two things at the same time, believing one thing and also believing another thing, and the tension that comes from that. Like, that is what humanity is, at least to me. I think that one of the most relatable things about Kathy is that she is spending her brief time in the sun, kind of shuffling along this path that has been laid out for her by people in power who don't care about her. And I think in 2026, that feels incredibly relatable. On the issue of dates, I do think it's important to point out that this book was written in 2005, and I think in that time, in the early to mid 2000s, the path that was kind of expected of people, especially in the West, I'll speak to kind of like Western culture, specifically American culture. That path was much more rigid back then than it is now. This was a much more heteronormative time, an incredibly homophobic time. People were expected, to be men and be women, and your purpose in life is to get a job, make money, have a family, have kids, and buy a house. And it's like that path is not as rigid today, and I think part of that is because of societal progress. I think that we have made progress as a society when it comes to gender and sexuality expectations. So I think that's good. I think part of the breaking down of those expectations are the results of material conditions, like the fact that real estate is so fucking expensive that the idea of owning a home is now out of reach for large swaths of the population. And so I do think that nowadays, we're more inclined to question this destiny than maybe the average reader was in 2005. And this is a tangent, and we'll get back to the book in a bit. But this does kind of make me think of some of the discourse about stereotypes about Gen Z and how they only do the bare minimum at work and they don't really show enthusiasm. And I think that that is a rational response to the experience that they have had. They watched as over-caffeinated, perky millennials like myself kind of smile and exclamation point and overwork themselves into the same financial precarity that they would have had if they had just kind of slacked off more and enjoyed their life. And so, do I get a little uncomfortable when the barista just kind of glares at me? Sure. That's just me. I support Gen Z and the Gen Z stare and the philosophy behind it, even if I'm a little too, insecure and cringe to partake in it myself. So, but back to the book. On the topic of art, this book brings up some interesting questions about the utility of art, because the art that is talked about in the book is everyone is trying to use it for something. The kids are trying to use it. Ultimately, the kids, the students, the clones, they are trying to use their art to save their lives. The organization that runs Hailsham, Madam, in her gallery, are trying to use art to prove that their students are humans. It's all about the utility of it. And I think it's interesting to have this discussion right now because of AI. One of the questions of the book is that can art show the soul? Can art reveal humanity? And it's if a computer can make a beautiful painting or a beautiful song or pretty soon a beautiful movie, does that mean that it has humanity? Does that mean that it has a soul? I think no. I say it doesn't, because I don't think that it is actually art. I think it is mimicry. And I think that the same is true for humans doing that too. If you are just, amalgamating things and putting things, just copying things, that's not art. That is slop too. I think that art comes from, again, it's one of those things that you try to define it and it slips out of your hand like a fish. But that's the beauty of it, is the paradox. So I don't know what the definition of art would be, but I know it when I see it. So I mentioned this book was frustrating. I think that maybe a better word for it, or a word to use in addition to frustrating, is uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable book, and a big part of that is because of the mirror that it holds up to us. It's the things that it's asking us to deal with, because it's asking us to look around our own world and say, okay, what are the clones standing in for? Is that factory farming? Is the way that we're treating animals evil? And are we, like the people in this fictionalized England, kind of okay with these clones being out of sight as long as we still get those organs that we need when we have a transplant. Is our relationship to hamburgers the same, where it's like, oh, I don't want to think about a cow being slaughtered, but I do like my burgers, I don't know. I mean, it makes me uncomfortable because like I think about factory farming and I think about how disgusting that is, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to support that. But then, I go out to a gastro pub and there's a burger, there's a bacon cheeseburger, and I'm like, damn, that's really tasty, And so I mean, this book has been making me think about that, and I don't like thinking about that, but I think it's important to wrestle with those things, and maybe you don't eat meat, but you probably have a cell phone. Maybe you're watching this on a cell phone, and it's like, well, where did the coltan in that phone come from? Where did the lithium in the battery come from? Is this supporting wars in places like the Congo? It's like, yeah, probably. These are uncomfortable questions. And the book doesn't give easy answers, because Kathy doesn't start the revolution, because, she and her friends don't fight against the system and make some sort of change. The book doesn't give you that catharsis. It doesn't scratch that itch. It doesn't soothe you. It doesn't let you know that, like, you know what, it's going to be okay because the good guys are going to win. It's starkly reminding you that, no, the bad guys often do win. Now, in 2026, do we need reminders of that? Perhaps not. Perhaps not. I think it's pretty clear that evil is doing just fine out there in the world. But I do think that the questions that this book is asking are some of the oldest questions that have ever been asked and are worth grappling with in our own personal lives. Like, what does it mean for you to wrestle with your own mortality? What does art mean for you? What is humanity? Especially with the onslaught of AI, I think that question is more relevant than ever. And I think these are things that we have to deal with in our hearts before we can deal with them in the world. Okay, so as I've said several times at this point, this book came out in 2005. Now, I remember 2005. I was there. And I remember how big of a deal human cloning was around that time, like the late 90s, early 2000s. It was a hot button issue, especially in the circles that I grew up in. That was kind of the American evangelical right wing. And if you want to know more about that milieu, check out my episode on the Left Behind books. If you want a kind of a snapshot of what that was like. And it was. I remember it being a big thing in the news. In 1996, there was the first cloned mammal, Dolly the sheep. Shout out Dolly. And it was very much kind of in the zeitgeist. And so when I read this book, I was like, you know what? I haven't heard about cloning recently. What's going on there? Are they still trying? What's the latest? And then I realized that, you really don't hear much about medical breakthroughs and medical technology, with the glaring exception of plastic surgery. There's been all sorts of innovations in that field, and so you hear about that. And you hear about, you know what, you hate it, AI. That is what you hear about these days. And it's almost as if a society built on the profit motive is only going to produce research and development that is profitable. There might be something to that. But I was curious, and so I went on a bit of a deep dive learning about the state of where cloning is at. And I learned some stuff that I thought was interesting. So the long and short of it is that no one has cloned a human being, at least not to the knowledge of the general scientific community. Turns out it's actually really difficult to clone primates. For cloning people, I mean, obviously there's all sorts of ethical roadblocks, as there should be. And but there's also like some technical limitations, like when you are cloning a human, or a mammal, you have to take the nucleus out of the egg cell. And when you do that on a primate, you end up more often than not taking out these like proteins that are necessary for cell reproduction. Other mammals, that's not the case. And so that's why they're able to clone things like Dolly the sheep or Barbara Streisand's dogs. That's a fun story. Look that up. But for humans and other primates, it's incredibly difficult, and so that's another reason why they've kind of stopped doing that. So where the research is at right now is it has pivoted into gene cloning, and specifically with something called induced pluripotent stem cells. So basically this is where they take an adult cell, like let's say it's a skin cell from your arm, and they're able to reprogram that in a way to bring it back to like a stem cell-like state. And then they can use that stem cell in all sorts of ways. And so that's really cool. And it sidesteps any of the ethical quandaries that come from like therapeutic cloning, which is where they create fertilized embryos and then harvest the stem cells from that. That was, again, another very hot button issue I remember growing up. That they still do that some, but it's mostly in research purposes, in like actual practice and helping patients in various ways. It's much more that other part where they're using adult stem cells. So the National Human Genome Research Institute has a great page about kind of the state of cloning right now. That's an organization that's run by the National Institute of Health, and I'll put a link for it in the description. It's a fun read. They also have a brief history of some of the claims of human cloning. For instance, in 2002, there was a cult called Clonaid that claimed to have cloned the first human child. And scientists were like, "Oh, that's interesting. Can you give us some proof?" And they were like, "Nope." So check out that page. And I'm fascinated by the story of Clonaid, but we do not have time for that because we've reached the time now where we are going to hear from my sister Emily. She sent in her thoughts on this book, and we're going to listen to them right now.
Hello, my name's Emily. I am Jonathan's sister. I told him a couple weeks ago that this was actually one of my favorite movies in high school, and that I had read the book a couple of years ago and thought it was really good. I think what was so appealing about the storyline and thoughtful and intentional about it was that it's a dystopian novel, but you don't really realize that until the end of it. Mm-hmm. Most of the novel is just trying to understand the characters and their relationships with each other, and how sometimes really small things can then really cause rifts in those relationships and tear people apart. But yeah, I thought it was just a really great depiction of what it means to both be in a relationship, but then also what it means to be in a friendship. And in fact, what it means to like be human too. So anyway, enjoyed the book, would recommend, and also would recommend the movie too. It was really great.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. And I enjoyed the movie. I don't think I loved it as much as you did, but we'll get into that in a second. You bring up some great points, Emily. I think maybe I've been a little harsh in my descriptions of Kathy and saying that the things that she's concerned with are insignificant, because they're not insignificant. I think I tend to look at it of like, oh, but the cloning, think of the cloning. And it's like, your life is lived one day at a time, and it's lived with the people around you, and I think that how you treat them and how you live with them is very important. And I think that that is the most human thing about Kathy is her relationships, and I think that is the most human thing about us. And I think that is the thing that, as I've talked about on this podcast before, is kind of threatened by so many forces in the world right now. There's so many things that are designed to disrupt our relationships with other people. And so I think that this book is a great reminder that, yeah, you're going to die. Yeah, your art's not going to save you. But you know what? There's people in your life who love you. And there's people in your life that you can love in return. And why not spend your brief time on this planet loving them? The movie, I'll talk about the movie very quickly. I enjoyed a lot about it. I think I watched it a little too soon after having finished the book, and so it felt, I don't know, somewhat repetitive, but that's not really a fault of the book. It's a very faithful adaptation, and the acting is phenomenal. Carey Mulligan is one of my favorites. Andrew Garfield is always fantastic. Keira Knightley is also very good as Ruth. And we got Donald Gleason in the mix, Andrea Riseborough, Sally Hawkins. Like it's a phenomenal cast. And I also really like the aesthetic of it. You know, I like the country setting and the seaside town. Like I love a quiet seaside town. You know, like if I end up in a quiet seaside town someday, I think there's worse ways. There's worse ways to spend your days. My biggest problem with the movie, though, is that the opening shot kind of spoils it. Like you see Andrew Garfield going in to like donate his organs. I feel like that kind of gives it away. I mean, maybe it doesn't if you're not familiar with the story, but for me, I was like, wait a second, you're kind of giving it away. But yeah, I like the movie. It's very sad. The book is very sad. It's it's not a fun book, but I think it's an important book. I think that the questions that it asks are crucial for each of us to kind of wrestle with in our own hearts. And I think it's something you should read. I think it's something that you should ponder and consider and stew on for a bit, and then go spend some time with people that you love. And that is going to do it for this episode of Shoulda Books. Thank you to everyone for watching and for listening. And as always, keep reading.